Okay, so carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. So these types of diuretics, they act on the proximal convoluted tubule. So it's this bit in the nephron, so literally just after the Bowman's capsule. So in this region, we reabsorb 60 to 70% of our sodium. However, carbonic anhydrase inhibitors are still considered low-seating diuretics, and I will explain why that is in a bit. So examples include acetazolamide and dorzolamide. Acetazolamide is a non-competitive reversible inhibitor of carbonic anhydrase. I'll say that again, it's a non-competitive and reversible inhibitor of carbonic anhydrase. It's just because it might be an MCQ question. I don't know. So mechanism of action, as it says on the name, they inhibit carbonic anhydrase, which is responsible for converting carbonic acid into water and bicarbonate, and vice versa, because this reaction is reversible. Okay, so it can convert bicarb and water back into carbonic acid as well. So it works both ways. So the net effect would be the loss of bicarbonate in our urine and some water loss. Only some, because as I said, they are low-seating diuretics, so they are not as potent as our thiazides or especially our loop diuretics. So they are much less efficacious than the others, and actually they are mainly used not as diuretics but for other reasons. So now let's discuss the mechanism of action of carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. So firstly, I just want to describe what happens in a normal physiological setting without the carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. So let's just forget about that for now. So let's just think in a normal physiological setting, this is what happens. So normally, our glomerulus is here. I just forgot to draw it. So from the glomerulus, we filter out our sodium and our bicarb into the nephron, into the tubule, which is this thing in blue. So as I said in the previous slide, this is where the maximum absorption of sodium happens. So we are at the level of the proximal convoluted tubule, where 60 to 70% of our sodium is usually reabsorbed. This is why there's kind of like lots of channels for sodium reabsorption at this level. So we have, for example, the sodium proton antiporter or exchanger, whatever you want to call it. We also have our sodium potassium ATPase. We always see this guy everywhere. So anyway, what happens is sodium is pumped out of the cell for the exchange of potassium to be pumped inside the cell. So the sodium potassium ATPase pumps 3 sodium out and 2 potassium back into the cell. And then sodium is reabsorbed into the peritubular capillaries, okay? So because sodium is being reabsorbed into the peritubular capillaries, we are creating a deficiency of sodium inside the cell. So this deficiency in sodium inside the tubular cell increases the driving force for sodium to be reabsorbed from the tubule into the cell. So where does that happen? So that reabsorption happens via this sodium hydrogen antiporter. So this sodium hydrogen antiporter, it brings the sodium in exchange for hydrogen out. So hydrogen then combines with our bicarbonate that's filtered into the tubule, right? So this combines with this. So we're now here. So our proton combines with our bicarbonate, forming carbonic acid, okay? And then via the action of carbonic anhydrase, carbonic acid is converted into, well, it's split into water and carbon dioxide, okay? And these compounds go inside the peritubular cell. So now we have our CO2 and our water inside the cell. And again, via the action of carbonic anhydrase, we convert them back into carbonic acid, okay? And then this carbonic acid, once again, splits into proton and bicarbonate. This bicarbonate is reabsorbed back into the peritubular capillary. And when it's reabsorbed, because it's negative, right? When it goes into the peritubular capillary, then we make the cell more positive. So that means that, proton doesn't want to stay there because it's already positive. And that increases the driving force for this hydrogen ion to be transported back out into the tubule via this sodium H plus antiporter, thereby facilitating the reabsorption of sodium. Okay? Just to summarize what's happening in a normal physiological setting, so the net effects would be our bicarb is reabsorbed into the peritubular capillary, our water is reabsorbed, and our sodium is reabsorbed. Okay, so now let's discuss what happens when we give carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. So in the tubule, this is where our carbonic anhydrase enzyme works. So if we inhibit carbonic anhydrase here, we prevent the conversion or the splitting of our carbonic acid into water and carbon dioxide. This means that our water is not going to be reabsorbed into the cell, okay? And then inside the cell, here's our carbonic anhydrase. If we inhibit this carbonic anhydrase, it means that we can't convert our carbon dioxide and water back into carbonic acid. And that means that we can't generate this proton and we can't make this bicarb, okay? So the net effects would be water is not being reabsorbed, and bicarb is not being reabsorbed in the peritubular capillary because it's not even being made because we've inhibited the carbonic anhydrase here. So this means that our bicarb here is getting rid into the urine, and that leads to metabolic acidosis, okay? So once again, let me just repeat the net effects. So the net effects is that water is not being reabsorbed, which means that water is staying in the tubule, which increases our urine volumes, our urine output, which is why it's a diuretic. Also, we are not reabsorbing our bicarbonate, which leads to metabolic acidosis. And then we're also not reabsorbing so much of our sodium. And again, where sodium goes, water follows. So that also contributes to the diuretic effect of carbonic anhydrase. So remember when I said we are in a state of metabolic acidosis because we're not reabsorbing our bicarb, we're just excreting our bicarb out. So this metabolic acidosis will actually trigger a compensatory mechanism. So usually our body's way of correcting acidosis is by retaining basic ions such as bicarb, so ions with a negative charge like bicarb, to neutralize the acids. So that means that our kidneys would actually reduce the amount of bicarb being filtered out in the urine. So that's the compensatory mechanism, meaning that the action of carbonic anhydrase inhibitor is sort of self-limiting, and that's why it's only a low ceiling diuretic. So let me just say that again. So the metabolic acidosis that's triggered by the excretion of bicarb triggers a compensatory mechanism. And to correct this acidosis that we've created, our kidneys are very, very smart. They reduce the amount of HCO3, of this bicarb that's being filtered out into the tubule, meaning that the action of carbonic anhydrase is self-limiting, and that explains why it's a low-ceiling diuretic. Okay, to finish off our discussion, let's talk about the uses, the adverse effects, and the contraindications for carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. So as I said at the beginning, carbonic anhydrase inhibitors are kind of obsolete as diuretics because they are not very powerful. They are low-ceiling diuretics, but they are used for many other things. So for example, they are used to increase seizure threshold. This is particularly useful in like absence seizures, for example. It's used to treat acute mountain sickness and altitude sickness. It's also very good for alkalinization of our urine. It's because, HCO3 is being retained in the tubule, which makes our urine more alkaline, and this is useful in the excretion of acidic drugs. Okay, so we learned this from the first lecture with our professor, that alkaline urine, right, makes it easier for us to excrete acidic drugs. So carbonic anhydrase could be used to alkalinize, if that's even a word, our urine. Okay, it's also used to treat glaucoma. This is because it reduces aqueous humor, which is basically just the fluid between the lens and the cornea. And then for adverse effects, we have obviously metabolic acidosis, as I've mentioned from the previous slide, as we are just peeing out our bicarb. And then we have hypokalemia. Okay, so we get hypokalemia, excuse me, we get our hypokalemia as our sodium has to travel all the way through the entire nephron. You know, because we were just at the level of the PCT, so that sodium that's not being reabsorbed has to go all the way through the nephron. And then when it reaches the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, our sodium is reabsorbed in exchange for potassium. Okay, so if you go back to the loop diuretics and the thiazides, you'll see me explaining this. So again, I'll say that again, sodium travels all the way through the entire nephron, and when it reaches the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, the sodium is reabsorbed in exchange for potassium. So we lose potassium in our urine, which leads to hypokalemia. So any diuretic, right, that sends the sodium all the way to the level of the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct to be reabsorbed would lead to potassium loss and therefore hypokalemia, as in those regions at the level of the DCT and at the level of the collecting duct. For sodium to be reabsorbed, we need to exchange it for potassium. So I hope that makes sense. I hope I didn't confuse you too much. Okay, so another adverse effect would be CNS toxicity. So I have read some reports showing that they might induce fatigue and confusion. So contraindications. So firstly, they are contraindicated for people with sulfonamide allergies, because, you know, an example of carbonic anhydrase is acetazolamide, which is a sulfonamide derivative. So don't give them to people with sulfonamide allergies. They are not used for people with renal disease of any sort, including kidney stones. They're also contraindicated for pregnant women. They could be, I think teratogenic is the word. There are definitely reports in animal studies that they might harm the fetus, but human studies, I didn't find any, but I think to be safe, they're contraindicated for pregnancy.